I never thought I'd be the kind of person who ends up in a story like this. You know, the kind you hear whispered at dinner parties or see splashed across some anonymous confession thread at 2 in the morning when you can't sleep and your mind starts wandering down all the dark hallways you usually keep locked. I was 37 years old, living in a nice but not flashy apartment in a converted warehouse downtown, with exposed brick and a coffee maker that cost more than my first car. I had a good job, a decent circle of friends, and a relationship that everyone around me described as solid. That word always bothered me, solid, like we were a piece of furniture, well-constructed and reliable, but not necessarily something you looked at twice. Her name was Megan, and we'd been together for 6 years. She was a graphic designer with a laugh that could fill a room and a way of looking at me that made me feel seen, truly seen, in a world where most people are just trying to get through the day without being noticed. We had a rhythm, a comfortable ebb and flow of workdays, weekend brunches, and the occasional argument about whose turn it was to empty the dishwasher. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I thought that was enough. The evening it all started to unravel began with a charity event. I know how cliché that sounds, a charity event, like something out of a movie where the lighting is soft and everyone wears black and pretends to care about a cause they'll forget about by the time they get to the valet. But this was different. It was for a local arts program, something I actually believed in, a place that gave underprivileged kids a chance to pick up a paintbrush or a camera and find a voice they didn't know they had. My friend David was on the board and he'd been hounding me for weeks to come. "It'll be good for you, man," he'd said. "Get you out of that apartment, away from your spreadsheets, remember there's a world out there." I'd rolled my eyes but agreed, mostly because I felt guilty for how many times I'd canceled on him lately. Megan was out of town for work, visiting a client in Chicago, so I figured I could put in an appearance, shake a few hands, and sneak out early to catch the game at a dive bar down the street. The venue was a converted warehouse, similar to my apartment but bigger, with towering ceilings and industrial lighting that cast long, dramatic shadows across the crowd. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the faint metallic tang of the structural steel. I remember feeling a little out of place, standing there in my navy blazer and crisp white shirt, nursing a glass of red wine that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The people around me were talking about gallery openings and investment portfolios, and I found myself nodding along, my smile fixed in place while my mind drifted to the mundane details of my week. It was then that I saw her. She was standing near the centerpiece of the event, a massive abstract sculpture made of reclaimed wood and twisted metal, and she was absolutely captivated by it. Not in the performative way of the other guests, who would glance at it and make some vapid comment before moving on, but truly captivated. She was studying its lines, the way the light hit its angles, with the kind of quiet intensity that you only see in people who genuinely love what they're looking at. Her name was Alina, but everyone called her Elle. She was 74 years old, with silver hair cropped short and styled in a way that felt both classic and effortlessly modern. She wore a simple black dress that fell just below her knees, a string of pearls that looked like they'd been in her family for generations, and a pair of sensible but elegant heels. Her face was a map of fine lines and laughter crinkles, the kind of face that had lived a full life and wasn't afraid to show it. She wasn't trying to look younger, and that was precisely what made her so striking. In a room full of people desperate to appear relevant, ageless, and important, she simply existed with a quiet, unshakable confidence. I found myself walking toward her without really making a conscious decision to do so. I stopped a few feet away, pretending to look at the sculpture, but my peripheral vision was entirely fixed on her. "It's breathtaking, isn't it?" she said, her voice low and warm like the crackle of a well-loved vinyl record. She didn't turn to look at me, just kept her eyes on the piece. "Yeah," I said, and I wasn't sure if I was talking about the sculpture or her. The way it captures movement in something so solid, it's almost contradictory. She turned then and her eyes met mine. They were a pale, clear blue, the color of a winter sky just before snow starts to fall. There was a sharpness in them, an intelligence that cut right through my carefully constructed small talk. "You see that too?" she asked, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Most people just see a pile of scrap. They don't understand the tension, the story behind each piece." We started talking and I completely lost track of time. She was an art historian, retired from a university upstate, and she had a way of talking about art that made it feel alive, not like some dusty relic of the past, but as a living, breathing language that connected people across centuries. She asked me about my work, and I told her I was in data analytics, expecting her eyes to glaze over like most people's did. Instead, she leaned in, genuinely interested, and asked me what stories the numbers told. That question floored me. No one had ever asked me that before. I told her about patterns I saw, consumer behaviors that mirrored historical events, the way data could reveal the hidden pulse of a society. She listened like I was saying the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly interesting. The crowd around us thinned as the night wore on, but we stayed rooted to that spot, moving from the sculpture to a quiet corner near a wall of windows that overlooked the city skyline. The lights of downtown sparkled below us, a million tiny points of electric life. She told me about her late husband, a writer who had passed away a decade ago, and about the life they'd built together, full of travel and passionate debates and a love that had only deepened with time. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a profound, tender acceptance. She spoke of his flaws with the same affection she spoke of his strengths, and I found myself envying the depth of a love that could survive not just death but the brutal honesty of a shared life. "What about you?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "Is there someone special? You have that look about you, the look of someone who's comfortable but not entirely at peace." I should have felt defensive. I should have brushed it off with a laugh and a joke about modern dating. Instead, I found myself telling her about Megan. I told her about our 6 years together, the comfort, the familiarity, the way we could finish each other's sentences. I also told her, without really meaning to, about the quiet hum of dissatisfaction that lived just beneath the surface of my contentment. The way I sometimes felt like I was sleepwalking through a life that was perfectly fine but not truly mine. She listened without judgment, without offering facile advice, just letting me spill my guts to a complete stranger who happened to be more than twice my age. "You know," she said, breaking a long silence, "comfort is a dangerous drug. It dulls the senses, makes you forget that you're still breathing, still wanting. It tricks you into thinking that because something isn't broken, it doesn't need to be fixed. But the heart, it's a restless thing. It wants what it wants, regardless of the logic we try to impose on it." I didn't have a response to that. I just looked at her, this extraordinary woman who had seen more of life than I could possibly imagine, and I felt something crack open inside me. It wasn't lust, not exactly. It was something far more profound and terrifying, a sense of recognition. Like I'd been walking through a fog for years and had finally seen a clear, unwavering light in the distance. When the event finally wound down and the last of the guests were filtering out into the cool night air, I found myself outside with her, waiting for the valet to bring our cars. The breeze carried the scent of rain from a distant storm, and she shivered slightly. Without thinking, I took off my blazer and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at me, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. I could see the pulse beating in her neck, the slight parting of her lips. She didn't say thank you, she just smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my heart race. That night I drove home in a daze. I parked the car and just sat there in the dark garage, the engine ticking as it cooled, replaying every detail of our conversation. Her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled, the scent of her perfume, something floral and ancient and deeply feminine. I walked into my apartment and it felt alien, like a stage set where I was the only actor who had forgotten his lines. I texted Megan, a routine "hope you had a good day" message, and she responded with a photo of her dinner and a row of heart emojis. It was so normal, so familiar, and for the first time it felt like a cage. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I couldn't stop thinking about a 74-year-old woman who had seen right through me in a single evening. I didn't know it then, but that moment, standing in the cool air with her, was a point of no return. The life I had known, the solid, comfortable life, was already beginning to fall apart. I just hadn't realized it yet. The days that followed were strange, like walking through a dream where everything looked the same but felt fundamentally different. I went through the motions of my life with a kind of mechanical precision, showing up to work, attending meetings, responding to emails, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It was caught in that warehouse, in the soft glow of the industrial lights, in the sound of her voice. I found myself looking up art history articles online during my lunch breaks, reading about movements I'd never heard of, artists I couldn't pronounce, just to feel closer to the world she inhabited. I'd catch myself staring out the window of my office, watching the clouds drift across the sky, and I'd wonder what she was doing at that exact moment. Was she in her garden, tending to the roses she'd mentioned in passing? Was she sitting in her study, surrounded by books and photographs, lost in thought? The curiosity was obsessive, and it scared me. I was a rational person, a data analyst, a man who built his life on patterns and probabilities. This wasn't supposed to happen to someone like me. Megan came home that weekend, her suitcase wheels humming across the hardwood floor as she burst through the door with her usual infectious energy. She was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, with her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and her face flushed from the flight. She threw her arms around me and I hugged her back, but I felt like a ghost in my own body. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the familiar curve of her back, but my mind was already gone, drifting back to a pair of pale blue eyes and a voice like velvet. She talked nonstop about her trip, about the client who had been impossible to please, about the amazing deep dish pizza she'd had in Chicago, about how much she'd missed me. I nodded in all the right places, made the appropriate noises, but I was performing. Every gesture, every kiss on the forehead, every squeeze of her hand felt rehearsed, like I was reading lines from a script I no longer believed in. She noticed something was off, of course. She always did. Megan had an intuition that was almost unnerving, a sixth sense for when the emotional weather in our apartment was about to turn stormy. We were lying in bed that first night, the familiar weight of her body pressed against mine, and she propped herself up on her elbow to look at me. "Everything okay?" she asked, her fingers tracing lazy circles on my chest. "You seem distant." I told her I was just tired, that work had been stressful, that I was dealing with a difficult project. It was a lie, and it tasted bitter on my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How could I explain that a single conversation with a stranger had unearthed a deep and unnameable longing that I didn't even know I possessed? She accepted my excuse with a gentle kiss and a whispered, "Well, let me take care of you," and she did. She made love to me that night with a tenderness that felt accusatory, and afterwards, when she fell asleep with her head on my chest, I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, feeling like the worst kind of coward. I couldn't stop myself from reaching out. A week later, I found myself searching for her online, typing her name into the search bar with trembling fingers. It was surprisingly easy to find her. She had a modest online presence. A few articles she'd written for academic journals, a profile on the university's emeritus faculty page, and a brief mention in a local newspaper article about the charity event. No social media, no public email address, nothing that made her easy to contact. It was a relief and a frustration. I told myself I was just curious, that I just wanted to see if she was real, if that night had actually happened. But I knew, deep down, what I was really doing. I was searching for a way back into her orbit. The opportunity came 2 weeks later in a form I didn't expect. David, my friend from the charity event, called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was knee-deep in spreadsheets. "Hey man," he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "I'm putting together a small dinner party for some of the board members and a few key donors. Nothing big, just to thank you for their support. I was wondering if you'd like to come. Last time you were a hit with the art crowd, and I could use someone who can actually hold a conversation about something other than stocks and bonds." My heart slammed against my ribs. I asked who was coming, trying to sound casual, and he rattled off a few names. Then he said, "And Alina's going to be there too. You know, the older woman you were talking to all night. She specifically asked if you'd be coming. Said she enjoyed your take on modern abstraction." I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my entire body. She remembered me. She had asked about me. It was a validation that I hadn't realized I was so desperately craving. I told David I would be there, and I spent the rest of the week in a state of heightened anxiety. I bought a new shirt, a deep burgundy one that I'd never worn, and I spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to decide what shoes would make the right impression. Megan was going to be out of town again, a work conference in Austin, and for the first time in our relationship, I was relieved that she wouldn't be there. The guilt was a constant companion, a low hum of self-loathing that I tried to drown out with work and mindless television. I told myself I was just going to the dinner to be a good friend to David, that my interest in Alina was purely intellectual, that I was just fascinated by her knowledge and experience. It was a paper-thin justification, and I knew it, but I clung to it like a life raft. The dinner was held at a beautiful old house in the hills, a sprawling craftsman with a wraparound porch and gardens that spilled over with late summer blooms. The evening was warm, and the French doors were thrown open to the patio where fairy lights twinkled like a constellation of earthbound stars. I arrived early, a calculated move, and I saw her almost immediately. She was standing in the living room, a glass of white wine in her hand, talking to another guest with the same quiet intensity I remembered. When she saw me walk in, her face broke into a smile that was like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. It was a smile that was just for me, and it sent a warmth flooding through my chest that I couldn't and didn't want to suppress. I made my way over to her, and for the second time the rest of the world seemed to melt away. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of champagne, and her silver hair was swept back with a tortoiseshell clip. She looked timeless. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. I found myself thinking about our conversation. Not many people can talk about art and algorithms in the same breath. "You're a rare breed, Jake." The way she said my name like it was something precious sent a shiver down my spine. We fell into an easy rhythm, picking up exactly where we had left off. We talked about everything and nothing, about the fading light, about a book she'd just finished, about the strange poetry of city traffic. She made me laugh, genuinely laugh in a way I hadn't in years. The dinner itself was a blur of clinking glasses and murmured conversation, but I was hyper-aware of her sitting 2 seats down from me. I could feel her presence like a gravitational pull, and I found myself stealing glances at her throughout the meal. She would catch my eye sometimes, and a subtle, secret smile would pass between us, a shared language that felt intimate and dangerous. After the main course, while the other guests were engaging in a heated debate about local politics, she leaned over and whispered, "I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this noise. Would you like to take a walk in the garden with me? I saw some stunning hydrangeas out back." It was an invitation, clear and unambiguous, and I accepted without a moment's hesitation. We walked along the flagstone path, the heels of her shoes clicking softly against the stone. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, and the crickets were singing their late summer song. We talked about her late husband again, about the house they'd owned in Connecticut, about the collection of impressionist art she'd had to sell after he passed. There was a vulnerability in her voice that she hadn't shown before, a rawness that made me want to protect her. We stopped under a trellis covered in climbing roses, and she turned to face me. The light from the house was a distant glow, and we were bathed in the soft silver of the moon. "Jake," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper, "I know you have a life, a girlfriend, a whole world that doesn't include me. But I can't pretend that I don't feel this connection. It's been a long time since I felt anything like it." I should have stepped back. I should have said something about Megan, about the years I'd invested in that relationship, about the person I was supposed to be. But I didn't. Instead, I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was soft, warm, and she didn't pull away. "I feel it too," I said, and my voice cracked on the last word. "I don't understand it, I don't know what it means, but I can't stop thinking about you." She stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same floral scent from that first night. She reached up and touched my face, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that made my knees weak. "This doesn't have to be anything," she said. "It could just be this moment, but I want you to know that it's real." "What I feel is real." I kissed her. I kissed her under that trellis of roses in that quiet garden with the sound of distant laughter drifting from the house. It was a soft, slow kiss, full of longing and confusion and the terrifying thrill of the unknown. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of discovery. When we pulled apart, she was smiling and there were tears in her eyes. "I didn't expect this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't expect you." We walked back to the house in silence, our fingers intertwined. I felt alive, electric, like I was seeing the world in color for the first time. But I also felt a profound sense of dread, a heavy stone in the pit of my stomach that whispered the name of the woman waiting for me back in my apartment. I was crossing a line and there was no coming back from it. I drove home that night with her scent still on my clothes, her kiss still on my lips, and I knew I was already lost. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and carefully constructed lies. I became a master of deception, a skill I never knew I possessed, and it terrified me how easily the lies rolled off my tongue. I told Megan I was working late, that I had to help David with another charity event, that I was going for a long drive to clear my head. She never questioned me, never looked at me with suspicion, and her trust was the most devastating weapon against my conscience. Every time I kissed her goodbye, every time I told her I loved her, I felt a piece of myself splinter off and fall away. I was becoming two people. The man who came home to a warm apartment and a loving girlfriend, and the man who drove across town to a quiet house in the hills where a silver-haired woman waited with a glass of wine and a smile that made my heart forget its own rhythm. Elle and I fell into a pattern that felt both reckless and inevitable. I would go to her house after work, parking my car a block away so the neighbors wouldn't notice the same sedan showing up night after night. Her home was a sanctuary, a beautiful old Victorian that she'd restored herself after her husband died. It was filled with art and books and the kind of curated chaos that spoke of a life fully lived. There was a sunroom at the back of the house with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a wild, overgrown garden, and that's where we would spend most of our time. We would sit on the worn velvet couch, our legs tangled together, and we would talk for hours. She would tell me about her youth in the 60s, about protest marches and free love and a world that was tearing itself apart and rebuilding itself all at once. I would tell her about my childhood in the suburbs, about the pressure to succeed, about the quiet desperation of a life that had always felt scripted. There was an intimacy between us that went far beyond the physical. She knew my mind in a way that Megan never had, challenging me, pushing me, refusing to let me settle for easy answers. She would ask me questions that kept me up at night. Questions about my purpose, my fears, my unspoken desires. With her, I felt seen, truly seen, not as a boyfriend or an employee or a son, but as a complex, flawed, and infinitely curious human being. She made me feel like I was still becoming, still capable of growth and change, and that was a gift I hadn't known I was starving for. The physical aspect of our relationship was tender and unhurried, a slow exploration of bodies that were separated by nearly 4 decades. There was a reverence in the way she touched me, a gratitude that made me feel sacred. In return, I worshipped her. I kissed every line on her face, traced the veins on her hands, whispered into her skin how beautiful she was. And she would laugh, that low, warm laugh, and tell me I was a fool. But she would also hold me tighter, and I knew she believed me. The guilt, however, was a constant companion. It would creep in during the quiet moments when she would fall asleep in my arms and I would stare at the ceiling of her bedroom, counting the cracks in the plaster. Megan would text me, a simple "good night, love you," and I would respond with the same words, my thumbs moving automatically while my heart wrenched in my chest. I was betraying her in the most fundamental way, not just by being with another woman, but by giving another woman the parts of myself that I had always reserved for her. I would lie awake sometimes trying to figure out how I had gotten here, how a single night at a charity event had unraveled everything I had built. I would tell myself that I needed to end it, that I had to choose, that the situation was unsustainable. But then I would see Elle's face, hear her voice, feel her hand in mine, and all my resolve would evaporate like morning mist. One night in late October, the air carrying the first bite of autumn, I sat in my car outside her house and couldn't bring myself to go inside. I had just come from a dinner with Megan and some of her friends, a painfully normal evening where I'd laughed at jokes and discussed vacation plans and watched her smile at me across the table with eyes full of trust. I had driven straight to Elle's after dropping Megan off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I sat there in the dark, the engine off, the silence of the night pressing in around me. I realized I was crying. Fat, silent tears rolled down my cheeks and I didn't even try to stop them. I was grieving for a life I was actively destroying, and the absurdity of it made me cry even harder. Elle must have seen my car from the window because she came outside wrapped in a cashmere shawl and tapped on the glass. I rolled down the window and she looked at my face and she didn't ask any questions. She just opened the door and took my hand and led me inside. She sat me down in the sunroom, made me a cup of tea, and waited. I spilled everything. I told her about the guilt, the fear, the feeling of being torn in two. I told her that I loved her and I meant it with every fiber of my being, but I also still loved Megan, and I didn't know how to reconcile those two truths. I told her I felt like a monster, like I was poisoning everyone around me, and that I didn't deserve the kindness she was showing me. She listened without interrupting, her fingers gently stroking my hair. When I finally ran out of words, she leaned forward and kissed my forehead. "Jake," she said softly, "I've lived a long time and I've learned that the heart is not a simple organ. It doesn't follow rules, it doesn't respect timelines or obligations, it just loves. And sometimes it loves in ways that are inconvenient, painful, and impossible to understand. I knew what I was getting into when I kissed you that night in the garden. I knew you had a life, a person, a whole existence that I was intruding upon. I made my peace with that. The question is, have you made your peace with it?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. I had been so consumed by my own guilt and confusion that I had never stopped to consider that she too was taking a risk. She was 74 years old with a reputation to protect, a life of dignity and respect. She was risking everything for me, a man half her age who couldn't even make up his mind. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear that she was hiding behind her calm exterior. She wasn't as unshakable as she seemed. She was just as terrified of losing me as I was of losing her. That night, something shifted in our relationship. The secrecy and the stolen moments felt less like a thrilling escape and more like a heavy burden. We started to have conversations that went beyond the abstract and into the practical. We talked about what a future might look like if there was even a possibility of one. She told me she had no desire to be a secret forever, that she was too old and too tired to play games. She said she needed to know that I was with her because I truly chose her, not because I was running away from something else. I promised her I would make a decision, that I would stop living in this limbo, that I would finally take control of my own life. But even as I said the words, I knew I was lying. I wasn't capable of making that choice, not yet. I was paralyzed by the fear of losing both of them. The pressure was building inside me like steam in a sealed container. I started making mistakes, small slips in my carefully constructed facade. I left my phone on the kitchen counter once, and Megan saw a text from Elle that was innocuous but intimate, a simple "thinking of you, can't wait to see you tonight." I grabbed the phone before she could read more, laughing nervously about a work colleague who didn't understand boundaries. She smiled and teased me about being popular, and the lie sat between us like a third person in the room. I started sleeping badly, dark circles forming under my eyes, and Megan would ask me if I was okay, her hand on my forehead, her voice full of genuine concern. I would tell her I was just stressed, and she would rub my back until I pretended to fall asleep. I was running out of excuses, running out of time, and running out of the energy it took to maintain the fiction. There was a day, a crisp Saturday afternoon, when Megan and I were supposed to go apple picking with her sister and her sister's kids. I begged off, claiming a sudden migraine, and she kissed me on the forehead with a tenderness that made my stomach churn. "You work too hard," she said. "Just rest, okay? I'll bring you back a pie." I watched her leave, the door clicking shut behind her, and I sat in the silent apartment and felt like the lowest person on earth. But as soon as the guilt started to overwhelm me, my phone buzzed. It was Elle asking if I wanted to come over and watch the sunset from her porch. I said yes before I could stop myself, and I was out the door within minutes. I drove to her house with a desperation that I didn't fully understand. I needed her, needed the peace she brought me, needed the escape from the noise in my own head. When I got there, she was waiting for me on the porch, 2 glasses of wine and a blanket draped over her lap. The sky was a riot of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that seemed to exist only in paintings. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the colors bleed into each other, the air growing cool as the sun dipped below the horizon. "I know you're struggling," she finally said, not looking at me. "And I know that I'm part of the struggle. I want you to know that if you need to walk away, I won't hate you for it. I will always be grateful for what we have. But I can't keep doing this to myself, Jake. I can't be the other woman forever." The words hit me like a freight train. I turned to look at her, and the tears were streaming down her face, catching the dying light. She had never cried in front of me before, not once. I reached for her, pulled her into my arms, and I felt her body shake with silent sobs. I held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, because she was. In that moment, I knew what I had to do, even if I didn't have the courage to do it yet. I had to choose. I had to end one life to begin another. And I had to do it soon, before I lost everything, before the lies consumed me and left nothing but ash. The decision came to me not in a moment of grand clarity, but in the quiet, mundane hours of a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my office, staring at a spreadsheet that I'd been pretending to work on for the better part of an hour, when my phone buzzed with a text from Megan. It was a photo of our cat, Milo, curled up in a sunbeam on our bed with the caption, "He misses you, we both do." It was such a simple, innocent message, the kind I'd received 1,000 times before, but this time it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked at that photo, at the familiar shape of our bedroom, at the way the light fell across the duvet we'd picked out together at that little boutique store in the village, and I realized that I was looking at a life I was about to destroy. Not just my life, but hers. I was going to shatter her world, and I was going to do it because I had fallen in love with someone else. There was no way to dress it up, no way to make it noble or justifiable. It was a betrayal, plain and simple, and I was the architect of it. I had spent months trying to convince myself that there was a way to have both, that I could somehow maintain this delicate balance without anyone getting hurt. But sitting there in that sterile office, surrounded by the detritus of my carefully constructed professional life, I knew the truth. I was deluding myself. The path I was on led only to a more painful, more spectacular crash. The longer I waited, the more damage I would do. I had to choose, and I had to choose now. The thought of losing Elle was unbearable, a cold, hollow ache that settled in my chest. But the thought of losing Megan was something else entirely. It was a guilt so profound that it felt like a physical weight, a constant pressure on my lungs that made it hard to breathe. I couldn't keep living this double life. It was killing me slowly, and it was going to destroy both of them in the process. I called Elle that afternoon, my hand trembling as I held the phone to my ear. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, and I almost lost my nerve. But I pushed through because I knew I had to. I asked if I could come over that evening, that we needed to talk, and there was a pause on her end that felt like an eternity. She knew, of course. She had always known this day would come, and she had prepared herself for it better than I had. "Of course, Jake," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be here." The drive to her house was the longest of my life. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, and the world outside my car window seemed to be moving in slow motion. I rehearsed what I was going to say over and over, trying to find the right words, the ones that would cause the least amount of pain. But there were no right words. There was only the truth, ugly and raw, and I had to face it. When I pulled up to her house, I saw her sitting on the porch, just like she had been that night when I'd broken down in my car. She was wearing a simple cream-colored sweater, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked so beautiful that it physically hurt me to look at her. I walked up the steps and she stood to meet me, her eyes searching mine. "Don't," she said softly, before I could even open my mouth. "Don't do this if you're going to regret it. If you're going to come back here in a month and tell me you made a mistake, I can't handle that. I can't handle that on top of everything else." I took her hands in mine and I felt them trembling. It was such a small, human detail, the tremor in her fingers, and it reminded me that for all her strength and wisdom, she was just as fragile as the rest of us. "I'm not going to regret it," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "I'm going to be with you, I want to be with you, but I have to do this the right way. I have to end it with Megan, she deserves that much." Elle nodded slowly, her jaw tight, her eyes glistening. "I know," she said, "I know you have to, and I know it's not going to be easy, but I need you to understand something, Jake. When you leave here tonight, when you go back to her and you tell her what you've been doing, you're going to feel a pain that you can't even imagine. You're going to want to take it back, to run back to the comfort of what you knew. And I need you to promise me right now that you won't. You have to stay the course for me, for us." I pulled her into my arms and held her tight, burying my face in her hair. "I promise," I whispered. "I promise I won't waver." I left her house that night with a heavy heart but a clear head. The decision was made and there was no turning back. I drove home slowly, taking the long way, trying to steel myself for what I was about to do. I walked into my apartment and Megan was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She was wearing that old apron she'd had since college, the one with the faded sunflower pattern, and she was humming along to a song on the radio. She looked up when I came in and she smiled, a wide, open smile that was full of love and trust and everything I was about to destroy. "Hey babe," she said. "I didn't expect you home so early. I'm making that pasta you like. Go get comfortable, it'll be ready in 10. I couldn't eat, I couldn't even sit down. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her move around the stove, stirring the sauce, laughing to herself about something on the radio. She was so vibrant, so alive, so completely unaware of the bomb I was about to detonate in the middle of her peaceful evening. She finally noticed me standing there, my face pale, my hands shaking, and she turned down the heat and walked over to me. "Jake, what's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I reached out and took her hands, and she looked down at our intertwined fingers, then back up at me, and I saw the fear flicker in her eyes. "Let's sit down," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We sat on the couch, and I held her hands and I told her everything. I told her about the charity event, about Elle, about the connection I'd felt that first night. I told her about the conversations, the secrets, the stolen afternoons. I told her about the love I had for another woman, a love that had grown quietly and powerfully in the shadows of our relationship. I didn't spare the details because I felt she deserved the truth, even if it was the most painful truth I could offer her. And as I spoke, I watched her face transform. The confusion, the disbelief, the dawning horror, and finally, the absolute soul-crushing devastation. She pulled her hands away from mine, her eyes wide and wet, and she stood up. She backed away from me like I was a stranger, like she didn't recognize the man sitting on her couch. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who is this woman?" I told her. I told her Elle's name, her age, everything. And when I said she was 74, Megan let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "She's 74, she repeated, shaking her head. "You threw away 6 years for a woman who's nearly 3 times your age. Is that a joke?" The tears came then hot and fast, and she started screaming at me. She called me every name in the book, told me I was a coward, a liar, a man who had no idea what he wanted. And she was right about all of it. I didn't defend myself. I couldn't. I sat there and took it, every barb, every accusation, because I deserved it. She threw a vase from the coffee table and it shattered against the wall, pieces of glass scattering across the floor. She told me she hated me, that she would never forgive me, that I had wasted the best years of her life. And then she collapsed onto the floor, her body racked with sobs, and I went to her. I knelt down beside her, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away from me. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice hollow. "Don't you ever touch me again." I stayed in the apartment that night, sleeping on the couch, listening to her cry in the bedroom. I didn't sleep at all, just stared at the ceiling and replayed every mistake I had made, every step that had led me to this moment. In the morning, she came out with red-rimmed eyes and a suitcase, and she told me she was going to stay with her sister. She looked at me, and there was no love left in her eyes, only a deep, abiding contempt. "I hope she's worth it," she said, her voice cold as ice. "I hope this woman is everything you wanted, everything I couldn't be, because you're going to lose everything, Jake. Everything you had, everything you built, it's all gone, and I don't think you even realize it yet." She walked out the door without looking back, and I sat on that couch, surrounded by the pieces of our shattered life, and I felt the full, crushing weight of what I had done. I had chosen Elle. I had chosen love, but I had also chosen a path of immense pain, and I was only at the very beginning of it. I called Elle a few hours later, my voice raw and broken. "It's done," I said. "She's gone." Elle didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she whispered, "Come to me, Jake, come home." And I did. I drove to her house in a daze, and she was waiting for me on the porch, just like always. She took me inside, and she held me while I cried, and she told me that everything was going to be okay, and for a moment I believed her. I believed that I had made the right choice, that I was finally on the right path, that the pain would fade and the love would remain. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had burned my old life to the ground, and I was standing in the ashes, holding onto a woman who was 74 years old, hoping that the future we were building was strong enough to survive the wreckage I had left behind. The days ahead would test us in ways we couldn't imagine. But for that moment, in the quiet of her sunroom with her hand in mine, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. The aftermath of my confession was a desolate landscape I had to navigate alone. Megan moved out completely within the week, her sister and brother-in-law arriving with a moving van to collect the remnants of our shared life. I stood in the doorway of our apartment, the one we'd picked out together, the one where we'd painted the living room a warm sage green and argued about the placement of the bookshelves, and I watched them carry out boxes of clothes, kitchenware, and the framed photographs that had documented our 6 years together. Megan didn't look at me, not once. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor or on her sister's face, and she moved through the space like a ghost, touching things for the last time, saying silent goodbyes to the life we had built. When the last box was loaded into the van, she walked past me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same one she'd worn since the day we met. She paused for just a second, and I thought she might say something, maybe curse me, maybe cry, maybe tell me she'd find a way to forgive me. But she just shook her head, a small, sad movement, and walked out the door without a single word. The silence she left behind was louder than any scream. I spent the first few weeks in a fog of grief and guilt. The apartment felt cavernous, every corner a reminder of the life that was no longer mine. I'd walk into the kitchen and expect to see her at the stove, her back to me, humming that same damn tune. I'd reach for my phone to text her about something mundane, something I'd seen on my way to work, and then I'd remember that I had no right to speak to her anymore, that I had forfeited that privilege. The guilt was a constant companion, whispering in my ear at all hours, reminding me of the pain I had caused, the trust I had shattered, the years I had wasted. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and I'd think about Megan's face when I told her the truth, the way her eyes had gone from confusion to horror to a cold, dead emptiness. I'd think about the vase shattering against the wall, the pieces scattered across the floor like the fragments of my own morality. Elle was my only refuge. I went to her house almost every night, seeking solace in her arms, in her quiet, steady presence. She didn't push me to talk, didn't offer empty platitudes, just held me while the weight of my choices pressed down on me. She was patient in a way I didn't deserve, gentle in a way that made me feel like I might actually survive this. But even with her, the guilt lingered. I would look at her, this beautiful, extraordinary woman who had given me everything, and I would wonder if I had made the right choice. Not because I doubted my love for her, but because I doubted my own capacity to make a decision that wouldn't end in disaster. I had destroyed one life to build another, and I was terrified that the foundation I was building on was made of sand. We tried to create a new normal, Elle and I. She would cook dinner for me in her beautiful kitchen, and we would eat on the porch, watching the sun set over her overgrown garden. She introduced me to her friends, a small circle of academics and artists who were surprisingly accepting of our relationship. I think they saw the way she looked at me, the way her eyes lit up when I walked into the room, and they understood that this was something real, something that transcended the boundaries of age and convention. They welcomed me into their world with open arms, and for the first time in months, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I started spending weekends at her house, helping her with the garden, fixing the creaky step on the back porch, painting the bathroom a soft shade of lavender that she'd been wanting to do for years. It was domestic and ordinary and deeply fulfilling in a way that my life with Megan had stopped being a long time ago. But there were cracks in our happiness, cracks that I tried to ignore but couldn't. The first was the simplest, the most mundane, the looks we got when we went out in public together. We'd be at a restaurant, holding hands across the table, and I'd catch people staring. Not with malice necessarily, but with a kind of curious bewilderment, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle. A woman my age, a man my age, what could they possibly have in common? I could see the calculations happening in their eyes, the assumptions they were making, and it stung more than I wanted to admit. Elle would just smile, her chin held high, and she'd squeeze my hand under the table. "Let them stare," she'd say. "We know what we have, that's all that matters." She was right, of course. But it was hard, constantly having to defend a love that felt so natural and right to me but looked so strange and inexplicable to everyone else. The second crack was deeper, more insidious. It was the realization that I was in a very different stage of life than Elle was. I was 37, still building my career, still figuring out who I wanted to be in the world. She was 74, with a lifetime of experiences behind her, a life that was winding down rather than ramping up. She would talk about her plans for the future, and they were so different from mine. She wanted to travel to places she'd never been, to see the northern lights in Iceland, to walk the beaches of the Amalfi Coast. But her travel had to be carefully planned, with accommodations for her arthritis, her pace slower than it used to be. I wanted to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, to backpack through Southeast Asia, to do all the reckless, youthful things I'd put off for the sake of a stable relationship. I wanted to start a family, or at least I thought I did, and that was something she couldn't give me. She had already raised her children, already lived through the sleepless nights and the teenage angst and the empty nest. She had no desire to go back to that, and I couldn't blame her. But the unspoken knowledge that I would never be a father hung between us like a shadow, a dark presence that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. We talked about it one night, sitting in the sunroom, a bottle of wine between us. The rain was falling in sheets outside, a late autumn storm that rattled the windows and made the whole house feel like a ship at sea. "I know what you're thinking," Elle said, not looking at me. "I see it in your eyes sometimes. You're thinking about the future, about all the things you're giving up." I opened my mouth to protest, but she held up her hand. "Don't lie to me, Jake. We promised each other honesty, remember? I'm not going to pretend I don't know the sacrifices you're making. I've been where you are. I know what it's like to love someone so much that you're willing to give up a part of yourself. But I need you to be sure. I need you to be so goddamn sure that when the doubt creeps in, and it will, you can push it aside and look at me and know that this is what you want." I took her hand and I told her with as much conviction as I could muster that she was what I wanted. I told her that the thought of losing her was worse than any sacrifice I could imagine. I told her that I had made my choice, that I had burned my old life to the ground for her, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. But even as I said the words, I could feel the doubt lurking in the shadows of my mind. I was young, I was still capable of change. And I had given up a future that included children, a white picket fence, and the kind of conventional happiness that society had taught me to crave. What if in 10 years I woke up and regretted everything? What if the love I felt for Elle wasn't enough to sustain me through the loneliness of growing old while she grew older still? I pushed those thoughts away, buried them deep, but they never fully disappeared. They were always there, humming in the background like a faint, discordant melody. The third crack was Megan. I hadn't expected her to reach out, and for the first few months she didn't. But then on a cold December night, a few weeks before Christmas, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a Christmas ornament, a little glass heart that she'd bought on our first trip together, the one we'd hung on the tree every year. The caption read, "I found this in a box of things I forgot to take, thought you might want to keep it or throw it away, I don't really care." It was such a small thing, a tiny, passive-aggressive gesture, but it sent me into a tailspin. I spent the rest of the night staring at that photo, feeling the full weight of what I had lost. I didn't respond, I couldn't. But I also couldn't stop thinking about her, about the life we had shared, about the version of myself that had existed before Elle had walked into my life. I didn't tell Elle about the text. I kept it to myself, nursing the secret like a wound. It was the first lie I had told her, the first crack in the foundation of trust we had built together. I told myself it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything, that I was just protecting her from an unnecessary hurt. But I knew deep down that I was protecting myself. I was keeping a piece of my old life alive, a secret sanctuary where I could retreat when the present became too overwhelming. It was a dangerous game, a betrayal of the promises I had made, and I knew it. But I was too weak to stop. The weeks that followed were bittersweet. The holidays were a blur of parties and gatherings, Elle's friends wrapping us in their warmth, their acceptance. She gave me a beautiful leather journal for Christmas with a note inside that read, "Write down your thoughts, your dreams, your fears. I want to know all of you, even the parts you're afraid to share." I used it, pouring my heart into the pages, documenting the complicated tangle of emotions that I couldn't articulate out loud. I wrote about Megan, about my fears for the future, about the immense, overwhelming love I felt for Elle. It was cathartic, but it also scared me. I was writing down the doubts that I was trying so hard to suppress, giving them a life on the page. Then in early January I got another text from Megan. This time it was longer, more desperate. "I can't stop thinking about you," it read. "I know what you did, I know you chose her. But I need to know if you're happy. I need to know if it was worth it, because I'm not. I'm miserable, Jake, and I hate you for making me feel this way." I read that text 100 times, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have deleted it. I should have blocked her number, but I didn't. I sat there in the dark, staring at the screen, and I felt the old pull, the familiar comfort of a love that had once been my entire world. I didn't respond, but I didn't delete it either. I kept it like a talisman, like a reminder of the road not taken. And in that moment, I knew that I was standing on a precipice, a fragile line between the life I had chosen and the life I had left behind. One wrong step, one moment of weakness, and I would fall. I just prayed that I had the strength to stay standing. The winter bled into spring and the world around me began to thaw, but the coldness inside me remained. I was living a double life again, but this time it wasn't about sneaking around behind Megan's back. It was about sneaking around behind Elle's, and that was a sin so much worse because she had given me everything, trusted me completely, and I was betraying that trust in the most cowardly way possible. I hadn't responded to Megan's text, not directly, but I hadn't deleted it either. I had kept it, read it over and over, and that was its own kind of betrayal. Then, a week later, she called me. I was at work, sitting in my cubicle, and when I saw her name flash across my screen, my heart stopped. I let it ring, let it go to voicemail, and then I sat there, staring at the phone, my hands shaking. She left a message, her voice hoarse and strained. Jake, I know I shouldn't be calling you. I know I told myself I'd never speak to you again, but I need to see you. I need to look you in the eye and understand how you could do this to us. Please, just one conversation. That's all I'm asking for. I told myself I was doing it for closure, for both of us. I told myself that she deserved an explanation, that I owed her that much after everything I had put her through. I told myself that I could meet her, listen to what she had to say, and then walk away clean with no loose ends, no lingering questions. I told myself a lot of things, and every single one of them was a lie. The truth was simpler and uglier. I missed her. I missed the comfort of her, the familiarity, the life we had built together. I missed the person I used to be, the one who hadn't made such catastrophic choices. And I was weak enough to let that missing drag me back into her orbit. We met at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a neutral ground that held no memories for either of us. I got there early, nursing a black coffee, watching the door like a nervous teenager waiting for a first date. When she walked in, my breath caught in my throat. She looked different. She had cut her hair short, a sharp, chic bob that framed her face, and she was thinner, the curves I had loved so much sharpened into angles. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, and she moved with a stiffness that spoke of a deep internal tension. She sat down across from me and we stared at each other for a long moment, the silence heavy with everything unsaid. You look good, I finally managed, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. I look like hell and you know it, but thanks for trying. She wrapped her hands around her cup of tea, not drinking, just holding it, as if she needed something to anchor her. I've been seeing a therapist, she said, her voice flat. She told me I need to confront you, to say the things I didn't get to say that night. She said it's the only way I'll be able to move on. I nodded, not trusting my own voice. So I'm going to say them, she continued, her eyes boring into mine. I'm going to tell you that you destroyed me. I'm going to tell you that I trusted you with everything I had and you threw it away like it was nothing. I'm going to tell you that I wake up every morning and I hate you, and then I hate myself for still loving you. The words hit me like a physical blow, each one a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain, to offer some kind of defense, but she held up her hand. Don't, she said, don't say you're sorry. Don't tell me it wasn't my fault or that you still care about me or any of the other things I've played over and over in my head. I don't want your excuses. I don't want your pity. I just want you to look at me and tell me the truth. Was it worth it? Was she worth losing everything we had? I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the pain I had caused etched into every line of her face. I saw the ghost of the woman I had loved, the one who had laughed at my stupid jokes and held me when I was sick and believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I saw all of it, and I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me like a mountain. But I also saw Elle. I saw her face, her smile, the way she looked at me like I was the most precious thing in the world. And I knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating that I had made my choice. It was an ugly choice, a painful one, but it was mine. I don't know if it was worth it, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I'll ever know, but I do know that I love her, Megan. I love her in a way I didn't know I was capable of. And I know that I hurt you and that I will carry that guilt with me for the rest of my life, but I can't take it back. I can't undo what I did. All I can do is try to move forward and hope that one day you'll be able to do the same. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give her. Then she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor, and she looked down at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. You're a coward, Jake, she said. You always were. You just took the easy way out and you called it love. But it's not love, it's fear. You're afraid of being alone, afraid of facing yourself, so you clung to the first person who made you feel less empty. And I hope for your sake that she doesn't realize it, because when she does, she'll leave you too and you'll have nothing. She walked out of the coffee shop and I watched her go, my heart aching with a pain I couldn't name. I sat there for a long time, staring at her empty chair, the remnants of her tea growing cold. I had done what I set out to do. I had given her closure, or at least I had tried, but I didn't feel any better. I felt hollow, scraped out like a shell of a man. I drove home to Elle's house, my mind a blur of guilt and confusion, and when I walked through the door, she was waiting for me in the sunroom. She took one look at my face and I could see the knowledge dawning in her eyes. "You saw her," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded and she let out a long, slow breath. "I thought we were past this," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought you had made your choice." I fell to my knees in front of her, the tears coming before I could stop them. "I did," I sobbed. "I made my choice. I chose you, but I had to see her. I had to try to make things right. I couldn't just leave her hanging, Elle. I couldn't live with that." She reached down and cupped my face in her hands, her thumbs wiping away my tears. "I know," she said, her voice soft. "I know you had to, but you need to understand something, Jake. I'm not going to share you. I will not be part of a triangle. You need to cut ties with her completely. No more calls, no more texts, no more secret meetings. If you can't do that, if you need that connection to your old life, then I need you to leave now before we go any further." Her words were a cold bucket of water, shocking me back to reality. I looked up at her, at the strength in her eyes, the steel beneath the softness, and I knew she meant every word. I had a choice to make, a real one, and I had to make it now. I took her hands in mine and I looked her in the eyes. "I want you," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. "Only you. I'm done with the past. I'm done with the guilt. I just want to be with you." She studied my face, searching for any sign of deception, and apparently finding none, she pulled me into her arms and held me tight. "Then let's move forward," she whispered into my hair. "Let's stop living in the shadows and start living our life." And we did. We started to plan. We talked about selling her house, buying something smaller together, someplace new that would be ours, not mine or hers. We talked about traveling, about seeing the world while we still could. We even talked tentatively about what our future might look like in the long term, about the challenges and compromises that lay ahead. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I hadn't made a mistake. Maybe this was the path I was always meant to walk. But even as I allowed myself to dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had burned my bridges, cut the ties, and now I was standing on a precipice, looking out at a future that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time I was ready to walk it.